We assume people followed old systems because they were tradition, but most people never chose those systems at all. When we look back at history, we often explain obedience with culture. People accepted feudalism because it was tradition. They accepted monarchy because it was customary. They accepted rigid hierarchies because that's just how things were. But that explanation is comforting and incomplete because tradition suggests choice, and most people in the past never had one. For most of human history, systems weren't something you opted into, they were something you were born inside. You didn't wake up one day and decide to support feudal hierarchy. You were born a peasant, raised a peasant, worked as a peasant, and died without ever seeing an alternative. Not because you believed the system was fair, but because there was no reference point for anything else. What surrounds you from birth doesn't feel political, it feels natural. Take feudal Europe. Land ownership, social rank, and obligation weren't debated ideas, they were facts of life. Nobles ruled because they always had. Peasants worked because that's what peasants did. Hierarchy wasn't defended with arguments, it was assumed the same way gravity is assumed. Not because people were loyal to tradition, but because nothing in daily life contradicted it. This is how systems persist, not through constant force, not through universal belief, but through normalization. When a system shapes your childhood, your expectations, your risks, and your options, it doesn't feel imposed. It feels inevitable. That's why so many historical systems lasted for centuries. Not because people loved them, not because they couldn't imagine better, but because imagining better requires exposure to something different, and most people never had that. Tradition didn't make these systems feel legitimate. Birth did. This is the mistake we make when we judge the past. We assume acceptance means agreement. We assume stability means support. We assume longevity means legitimacy. But often it just means people adapted to the only world they knew. And that brings us to the real lesson. Systems don't feel natural because they're old. They feel natural because they're all people have ever experienced. History changes not when people suddenly reject tradition, but when constraints shift, alternatives appear, and what once felt inevitable becomes visible as optional. So the question isn't why people accepted old systems. It's this: which systems feel natural to us today simply because we were born inside them?